exactly sure if I should begin by defining what should development be, because I usually just latch into the processes of development that have taken place without beginning by defining it. So what I would just like to do is to just give some broad strokes on starting from the crisis of so many countries in Africa. Of course, Mamadou will detail a lot of that, in Latin America and in Asia, which is a crisis of the disintegration of our economies. And the disintegration of our economies has also occurred during the era of globalization. Okay? So globalization, I think, if you want a simple definition of globalization, it has been the accelerated integration of production and markets dominated by transnational corporations. And this integration at a global level being accompanied by the disintegration of national economies. And I think that to really understand the processes of migration, why they have become particularly acute over the last 30 years, we cannot divorce that from the disintegration of our economies in a period of liberalization, by which they were opened up, and a period of globalization, whereby our economies or parts of our economies were integrated under the logic of transnational capitalism. So basically, I think this dynamic between disintegration of national economies and integration by the logic of transnational capitalism is what has produced this tremendous crisis, one of whose elements has been the massive migrations that have taken place. Then I want to just go to the beginning, in the period from 1950s and the 1960s. This was a period of decolonization. This was a time when countries were able to achieve independence, a lot of it formal rather than substantive independence. Some of them did it through national liberation, and some of them were achieved without armed struggle, through more conservative elites coming to power. But nevertheless, I think this period of the 1950s and 1960s were a period in which countries came into the world stage as formally sovereign countries, and all of them, from conservative to the left, wanted some form of national development that was expressed in the desire for industrialization. So development was then identified with moving away from being agriculture-based to becoming industrialized. And it was accepted during that period, again, from the right to the left in many of these countries, that the main actor in terms of industrialization would be the state. And whether it was the Brazilian generals or it was Fidel in Cuba, or it was Nkrumah in Africa, or it was Nasser in Egypt, the whole idea was that private capitalism could not bring about development, and the state had to be the central actor in this process. And so the 1960s and 1970s, in fact, saw in so many developing countries state-assisted capitalism come into being. In some countries, it was not state-assisted capitalism. It was more national liberation economics, or as Mao called it, the national democratic period. But in any event, the state was a central player. The 1960s and 1970s saw that the developing countries were in fact registering something like relatively high rates of growth. I think the average for the 1960s was around, something like 4 to 5%, and the 1970s too. The average rate of growth of developing countries was something of the same level as 4 to 5%. So, with some countries being higher and some a bit lower. But the point was that the 1960s and 1970s were a period of growth, even defined traditionally by GDP growth, the rate of growth of GDP. This was, however, a period that came to a close in the late 70s. And I think there were a number of reasons that this came to a close in the late 70s. So many of these countries had, again from the left to the right, had entered into loan agreements with commercial creditors in the South, and basically incurred very high levels of debt in the pursuit of developmental objectives. And as a result of that, they became basically tied to their creditors. And partly because of this, you had the debt crisis of the early 1980s. So across the board, what we had was countries entering high levels of debt, mainly to commercial creditors, principally to American banks, and because the American banks recycled into other third world countries the tremendous reserves that were parked in these banks by the OPEC countries that were able to change the balance of power in terms of the oil industry in the 60s and 70s through OPEC. But the point I wanted to say here was that the debt crisis ended this period of state-led industrial development in the South, which had did achieve, in traditional terms, relatively decent levels of growth for developing countries.